When Secret of the Mimic came out, I thought that I'd finally solved the timeline, or at least the relevant parts. I had an idea for what year David died in, when Secret of the Mimic would take place, how Tales games had to be factually impossible, all of it. And then, the game threw 100 curveballs and seems to have accidentally broken the timeline in the process, which is really annoying because I was so close to being right about a mystery that's gone unsolved for years. And now it's just cooked. But, at least Tales Games is still dead. Okay, let me start from the top. This is the Yay 40 room. It's a room from Security Breach that looks like it's meant to be for someone's birthday. And it's always stood out to me as important. When Secret of the Mimic came out, I immediately noticed a few very relevant things. The cakes, both the whole cake and the slice, and the balloons in this room line up perfectly with David's birthdays. The cake is identical to the cake he had on his first birthday, and the balloons are identical to the ones from his fifth. This realization connected dots that my brain didn't even know existed, and suddenly, I had the answer. The answer that I'd been looking for years. The Yay 40 room, one of the final mysteries in Security Breach, is for David. I couldn't believe I'd never realized this sooner. It felt so freaking obvious now. There's only one other time that we hear of a specific 40-year time gap in this series, and that's during The Storyteller. In The Storyteller, we're told that Edwin is 64 years old, and that his late son David was born when he was 24. Connecting the Mega Pizzaplex to a time exactly 40 years after David's birth, and then slotting in a 40-year birthday party that makes literally zero sense in any other context. It feels so blatant. So I thought that it was over. I was so confident that I was correct, that I had finally cracked the case. And then I started to actually think about Secret of the Mimic more, and actually, it doesn't work at all. All of the dots that felt like they connected so perfectly, ruined by every theorist's mortal enemy. Timeline placement. You'd think something like this would be the key to making the timeline work, but no! Steel Wool just had to screw it all up. And it's not like there's one tiny slip-up that you can just chalk up to a silly little mistake, either. There are a myriad of reasons as to why my original thought no longer works. There isn't even hope for making it work right anymore. Here, let's go over all the facts real quick, just so you can understand my exasperation right now. Firstly, we know the exact date that this game takes place. September 7th, 1979. We know this because of this sheet of paper that we find in Arnold's truck, telling us the date and the task that he's been given. We also have a rough estimate of when David's birthday is due to the mail that we pick up in the game, specifically the admin wing. We know that David's birthday party is scheduled for December 6th, and that this particular December 6th lies on a Saturday. Technically, there's a chance that his birthday is a few days earlier than this, and that they just wanted to save the party for the weekend, but either way, we at the very least have narrowed down his birthday to the first week of December. And we can take this a step further. Since December 6th falls on a Saturday this year, we can look at old calendars to figure out that this party was scheduled to happen in 1975. In addition to that, we know that this birthday was canceled due to a tragic event on the day that it was meant to happen. And since we have reels of all of his birthday parties that we not only can, but are actually required to place in chronological order, we know that the birthday that was planned in this room was his 5th birthday. This means that David died on December 6th, 1975, the day he was turning 5 years old. Now, by proxy, that would mean that he was born in 1970. And since we can tell from the reels that Fiona died at a fall fest shortly before his 3rd birthday, that places her death in the fall of 1973. Pretty solid so far, right? We're able to put all of this together only using what the game tells us, without making any logical leaps whatsoever. Everything I just told you is hard evidence that you'd have to bend over backwards to interpret any other way. So, what happens when we apply this hard evidence that Steelwool has given us to the idea that the Yay 40 room is for David? Literally everything falls apart. The Yay 40 room, the achievement icon, the time frame for when research and development opens. Literally all of it just doesn't make any sense. All the dots that I thought should connect, gone, with a couple of in-game emails and video reels. In the game, when you get to the room where David's 5th birthday was meant to be held, you get the achievement Belated Birthday, with 6 candles on it, 2 of them being on a melted part of the cake. Now, I made an entire video talking about this, so you all know what this was screaming to me. Following the timeline given in Tales, David died before he turned 5. Fazbear sends in Dominic's team from the Mimic into the factory in January of the next year. We know they sent at least one team before him, and knowing Fazbear, they'd send more teams in afterwards. Secret of the Mimic could absolutely occur in tandem with when David should have turned 6. It was perfect. It was amazing storytelling. As soon as I saw it, literally everything clicked into place for me. And I think that anyone who saw this achievement for the first time and started to sit down and think about it would come to the same conclusion really easily. But it's wrong. It's completely wrong. Despite the achievement very directly telling you what I just said, it's fundamentally impossible. Because Secret of the Mimic doesn't take place the year after David died. It's taking place 4 years after he died. David would have been 8 years old, only 3 months away from turning 9. So this achievement icon, this cake, it literally doesn't make any amount of sense. Why are there only 6 candles when David should be 8 now? Hell, there's literally no point in time where David being 6 years old is relevant to this story now. He dies when he's 5. The game takes place when he's 8. Why is 6 suddenly the important number to illustrate here? And believe me, it doesn't stop there. There's a lot more to go over with this mess of a timeline. The next thing that doesn't make sense is when and why research and development opens. A common sentiment around the community is that R&D is where the Mimic was built. But, again, that's not possible. Not only do we find what seems to be the work area where Edwin works on Mimic endoskeletons in the freaky tiger maze area, but we hear Fiona talking as the Mimic on David's 4th birthday. And as we've established, that would be in 1974. We know that R&D opened in 1975. So the idea that this branch was made for the purpose of building M1 or even for M2 is, again, completely broken. And believe it or not, the reasoning for the Yay 40 room not working is even more egregious. If David's 40th birthday is being represented at the Pizzaplex, that would mean that the Pizzaplex would have been created in, by the absolute latest, 2010. Meaning that the Pizzaplex was created before Fazbear's Fright from FNAF 3. The absolute earliest that FNAF 3 can take place is 2015. Which would mean that for some reason, Fazbear's Fright was built outside of the Pizzaplex while it was still running. It would also suggest that FNAF 6 shouldn't have happened yet. And, obviously, all of this doesn't make sense for an infinite number of reasons that I don't think I need to elaborate on. If the Yay 40 room is meant to be for David, then the only way we could possibly make it make sense is if it's 40 years after David's happiest day, the one we make happen during the storytime ending of Secret of the Mimic. If that's the case, then it would mean that this room had to be created in 2019, which, believe it or not, that's not the most unbelievable thing ever. If you ignore the fact that the party in the Yay 40 room is scheduled for March freaking 9th, which doesn't line up with anything, not his birthday, not the day Arnold goes into the factory, nothing. However, if we use Vanessa's AR email username, Nessie97, to say that she was born in the year 1997, and cross-reference that with the one implying she'll be 23 on her next birthday, that would mean that the earliest that Security Breach can take place is 2019, sometime before September. It's a bit of a stretch, but theoretically speaking, it's possible. That would mean that the birthday room is being used to celebrate 40 years since someone's rebirth? Or maybe if you think we saw David move on, it's 40 years since their death, which is just horribly morbid and still doesn't line up with Secret of the Mimic being in September instead of March. Speaking of things being incredibly stretchy, this isn't the only thing about this timeline that doesn't make any sense. Honestly, it kind of feels like everything in this game threatens any integrity that the timeline has left. For example, underneath MCM, in the prototype version of Freddy's, we can find the map for FNAF 3. What the fuck? As I said earlier, FNAF 3 takes place, at the earliest, all the way in 2015. If it's 30 years after the closing of Freddy Fazbear's, and it's referencing being 30 years after the events of the original closing of a Freddy Fazbear's, not a Fredbear's, which happened in response to the MCI in 1985, this places FNAF 3 in 2015. 36 years after the events of Secret of the Mimic. So the FNAF 3 map being here makes literally zero sense. Speaking of things that make zero sense, you know how Afton died because of a spring lock failure caused, presumably, by the water dripping from the ceiling? Well, as it turns out, this death was 100% avoidable, because in Secret of the Mimic, we find out that Edwin built safer spring locks. They're so safe, in fact, that the floor literally gives out underneath Arnold while he's wearing the Captain Springlock suit, and he's perfectly fine. Why didn't William implement these spring locks ever? Or at least repurpose them for when he started killing kids? The spring Bonnie suit was already out of commission by the time that William started using it for the MCI. He could have very easily either implemented them into this suit, or made a new suit, or literally anything. Instead, he decided to go about this in the worst way possible, and it ends up being the reason that he dies. To be fair, this is at least a little poetic, having him die because he had too much of an ego to use Edwin's newer creations, and continued to use his and Henry's much riskier suits instead. And on the note of William having the opportunity to reuse Edwin's assets, why did he wait so long to take his stuff? If we can assume that anything from Tales is still reliable, then Edwin more than likely cut contact within weeks of David's death. That means that sometime in 1976, all of Edwin's stuff was probably up for grabs, and we don't go to pick any of it up until 1979? Technically, there were teams that did go in before us, but surely it didn't take 3 years before someone competent enough was sent to grab the Mimic's schematics. And surely the only person competent enough wasn't the person who started this mission running on 36 hours of no sleep. Right? Anyway, back on the topic of things that Afton had access to from Edwin. Do we want to talk about the literal remnant farm in MCM's basement? 'Cause it's a thing! It's certainly a thing that exists. And since it exists, doesn't that mean that Afton could have theoretically known about Remnant before the MCI? On one hand, this could mean that Afton had inspiration for killing children and building the Funtime animatronics to kidnapped kids and extract Remnant from them since... oh gods. Since before Cece died. Is this accidentally Eliza First evidence? Nope, stop thinking that. But, speaking of Elizabeth and how she died, was that really necessary? I mean, Edwin got all of this remnant without kidnapping and murdering children. It seems to be the concentrated energy from recycling large amounts of metal. So, again, why did Afton do this? Like, I get that he's screwed up in the head and that nothing about him really makes sense in the first place, but still, why? He could have just kept doing what Edwin was doing and probably never been caught. And you know what else doesn't make sense? The FNAF 4 house was Edwin's. Out of everything that William could have stolen and used for himself, all of the things that would have made his life infinitely more convenient, He chose the house and nothing else? That's just a middle finger to the Murrays at this point, and for absolutely nothing. Edwin didn't even do anything to him. Okay, thinking about William's actions, and lack thereof, is getting annoying. Let's pivot to something else. A few minutes ago, you heard me bring up the R&D branch, and that the mimic wasn't made there. Which begs the question, what prompted the R&D project in the first place? Can't have been David's death, because it hadn't happened yet. The R&D branch was created in July of 1975, a few months before he died. And, like I said earlier, we know that it wasn't made for the sake of creating M1, because M1 already existed by 1975. So, what prompted the creation of it? We don't really have an answer for that, and I'd be surprised if we ever got one at this point. Now, on to something that's bothered me since we first got our hands on the game. Fiona's death. The circumstances of her death don't make any sense, especially the location. We're pretty explicitly told that Fiona died at Fall Fest, and that this particular Fall Fest more than likely burned down. But let me ask you something. Where is Fall Fest? Well, the first time we hear of Fall Fest is in Curse of Dreadbear from Help Wanted 1. When we load into the DLC, we're brought to our new hub world, the burned down remains of Fall Fest 83. And now, with modern day context, when we take a look around our environment, we realize something. We're at Murray's Costume Manor. There has, literally, never been another house on a hill next to a lake in the entire series. Especially not another instance of the FNAF 4 house on a hill next to a lake. So the fact that we're being shown one here, and considering Fall Fest's relevance to the Murrays, it means that Murray's Costume Manor and the Fall Fest location are one and the same, which is actually a massive problem. In Secret of the Mimic, we learned a new detail about Fall Fest. Fiona died during it, or at least during the setup for it. This has some interesting implications. For one, it confirms there was a Fall Fest in 1973, since that has to be the year that Fiona died. There isn't anything wrong with this, but it adds weight to the idea of it being a yearly event at least between 1970 and 1983. But secondly, it kinda screws with everything that has to do with the circumstances of Fiona's death. Think of it like this. Fiona explicitly tells Edwin that she's going to go away for about a week to go to Fall Fest, and that she's preparing a babysitter for David. This makes sense in isolation until you realize that she wouldn't actually be going anywhere. Fall Fest is literally right outside of their home. She would probably still be sleeping at home for the duration of the week. So the fact that she's telling Edwin about going away and preparing a babysitter for David just feels unnecessary. I can understand having someone else help her watch over David while Fiona is more busy with taking care of Fall Fest. That part makes sense. But talking about going away for a week when you're literally just stepping outside doesn't make any sense. Heck, at that point, her mysteriously dying at Fall Fest barely makes any sense either. This is literally their home. It's the most controlled environment there is. There's also, the massive building in the way of where Fall Fest was supposed to be. There isn't even any room for an attraction to exist here, so how was this event ever supposed to be hosted here? In isolation, Fiona going to Fall Fest and tragically passing makes sense. But within the context of the rest of the information we have, it kinda just falls apart. Speaking of Fiona's death, the timing of it does actually help explain one thing: the profit graph. In Secret of the Mimic, you can find a graph going over MCM's profits. They were going steady for a long time, and then in 1973, they hit both a massive spike and a massive fall-off. I think that the spike probably comes from working with Fall Fest and Fazbear Entertainment while it was still profitable for them, at least, followed by a fall-off immediately after Fiona's death, since Edwin specifically states that Fiona is his best creator and artist, calling her the heart of the company. However, true to Secret of the Mimic fashion, for everything that makes sense, there's also something that doesn't make any sense. And in this case, it's the end of the graph. This graph completely stops at 1975. There's nothing else going on here. Now, using the knowledge from Tales, it's fair to assume that this is where Edwin went off the deep end and disappeared. We even hear the audio log of him taking out his frustrations on M2 when he starts to act more like David, just like in Tales. So on paper, this all makes sense, right? Well, at first, that makes sense. If not for one thing. Edwin was still taking orders in 1977. We can find a work order for a suit that's dated January to April of 1977. Specifically, for the birthday puppy suit. Note the, expressive tongue. If Edwin went off the deep end in 1975 and everything stopped, then why was he still taking on work all the way into 1977? It's yet another contradiction within the game that, the more you think about it, the less sense it makes. And on the note of things that make no sense, there are people who think that Fiona is possessing the mimic that's chasing us for the entire game. I don't know where this belief comes from, but I don't particularly understand it. For the entire game, Fiona is trying to push us forward and keep us from dying to the mimic. That's her entire plan. Keep us alive so that we can do her work for her. Because she can't do it herself. So not only would it not make any sense for her to be trying to kill us throughout the game, it also doesn't make any sense for her to have a body to begin with. But speaking of mimics in this game, there are at least two. One that is constantly chasing us, and another seen during the secret ending of the game in the FNAF 4 room. There are a lot of reasons why we know that these two mimics are separate, but the most important one is this. Here's a clip from the secret ending, and I want you to listen really closely to what happens after David goes to bed. Did you hear that? Something is coming through the vent. And there is quite literally nothing else that can be coming through this vent. There's nothing else inside of Edwin's house. It has to be the other mimic, the one that's been chasing us for the entire game. So, that begs the question. Who is the mimic that we find in the FNAF 4 room? The one that hasn't been chasing us? Well, that's simple. It's David. I've been saying that mimic's haunted for months now, and finally, we have visual proof of it. This is a mimic that's literally showing us how haunted it is. When a story is being read to it by Edwin and Fiona's voices, we see it shrink down to the size of a 5-year-old and stand there listening. But as soon as the story stops, it grows in size again and tries to attack us. Until we continue the story, and it shrinks right back down. This sequence is literally David fighting for control against the Mimic AI. The Mimic program has learned violence and is trying to attack Arnold for the entirety of the scene. But David doesn't want to. He's just a little kid, an innocent child who misses his parents and doesn't want to hurt anyone. David just wants his story time. He wants to listen to his parents give him a bedtime story so that he can go to bed and rest. And once we finish the story and shut down the AI program, that happens. David, now with full control of the endoskeleton, fully shrinks down to the size of a child, takes his tiger plush, and goes to bed. So, this is, without a doubt in my mind, the mimic that David possesses. And not only that, this is either the same mimic that we saw Fiona using in the birthday reels, or created from its recycled parts. Think about this. How would David have actually possessed a mimic Indo? Well, considering the circumstances surrounding his death, Edwin specifically sent the Fiona mimic out to go get him.
Everyone hide. Fiona, go get him.
Just like how Charlie died outside and possessed the puppet when it went to go find her, David died outside and possessed the mimic when it went to go find him. It's the exact same scenario we've seen before. This does, however, raise a new question. Which mimic did Edwin attack in the audio log? We hear him attack a mimic for acting too much like David. And with what we know now, you'd think that he was attacking the one that David actually possessed. Thing is, you only find this mimic in a room that's been completely sealed off. The door is barricaded and the vent is locked until we insert all of the storytime tapes and climb through ourselves. So the David mimic can't leave the FNAF 4 bedroom, and the R&D mimic can't have gotten in. But in another audio log, we can hear Edwin in pain and seemingly dying, having lost the use of his legs after an explosion during an experiment, while there's a mimic in the room with him, ignoring his pleas for help. He calls out for M2, and, specifically, apologizes for never fixing him. This implies that this mimic was broken, and the most logical connection to draw was that this would be the one Edwin took out all of his anger on. But it can't be the David mimic, because that one is barricaded into the FNAF 4 bedroom. Edwin can't have done that if he was dead. And if it's the other mimic, the R&D mimic as it's referred to in the files, then why did Edwin barricade the other one in the bedroom but beat the heck out of this one? There's a disconnect here. Only one of them can be David, which should be both the obviously haunted one and the one Edwin beat up. But it's a logical impossibility when you start to think about the timeline at large. For now, I think that I have to go with the idea that the one that Edwin attacked is the R&D mimic, although whether this is the one that chases you for the entire game or yet another mimic that you awaken when you go to Proto Freddy's is up for debate. And speaking of which, don't you find it interesting that this area looks so similar to the Help Wanted hub world? And that the hub world for the Curse of Dreadbear DLC looks a lot like the outside of MCM, with the house up on the hill and the lake out front. Since Help Wanted was where we first saw Glitch Trap, which might have been the first hint we ever got toward Mimic being a character in these games, is there a chance that these hub worlds were created because they're areas from Mimic's memories? I think it's possible, and it would be a cool payoff for something that we didn't even consider would be a payoff way back when Help Wanted 1 first came out. Okay, I've been going on multiple loosely related rants for this entire video, but there's one last thing to cover. This game, perhaps inadvertently, affects something about the lore that's been a bit of a talking point for a long while now. It eliminates one of the options for the one retcon that Scott made. For those of you who don't know, Scott confirmed before FNAF 6's release that he's only ever made one true retcon to the series, but refused to elaborate as to what that was. One of the options that people had considered was a line from FNAF 1, where phone guy, Ralph, says that the animatronics had existed for 20 years. Since we know that Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was first opened in 1983, and FNAF 1 takes place sometime in the 90s, 20 years doesn't actually line up with anything. And because of this, for a while, there were people who thought that this line was the retcon. However, with Secret of the Mimic, we now know that this isn't true, because we can see all of the animatronics. They've existed since the 70s. Probably for years before the events of the game. Since the R&D department was made in 1975, I'd assume that the Proto Freddy's location where you see the Core 4 has existed since around then. This would mean that by the time of FNAF 1, these animatronics had been around for about 20 years. It might not be exact, but it's pretty freaking close. So, everything else is broken and on fire, but at least the line about the animatronics performing for 20 years makes sense now. With that said, I want to say thank you to my channel members, Ballsfrog, Embrisk, Kepi, Crashmaster, and Cryonide. I'll see you guys in the next one, and have a
Fazerific day!